Welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast, the podcast that explores the issues, stories, and people that have shaped places into what they are today. Here's your host, Adam Kamek.
If you're interested in starting a podcast, then Podcaster's Paradise is an invaluable resource for you. With step-by-step video tutorials, a tremendous number of resources and templates, and daily support, Podcaster's Paradise is by far the most important resource for any aspiring podcaster. Plus, if you join Podcaster's Paradise through my link, then I will promote your podcast on the show. Check out Podcaster's Paradise at placesandprofiles.com/paradise. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Sarah Beth Cox about the history and significance of Mount Rushmore. Sarah Beth is lead park ranger interpreter at Mount Rushmore National Memorial. You can find more information on the website for Mount Rushmore National Memorial at nps.gov/MORU and on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube under Mount Rushmore NPS. For more information, please check out the show notes page for today's episode at placesandprofiles.com/24. Sarah Beth, welcome to the show.
Thank you, and thank you for the introduction.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. So let's start with the origins of the idea for Mount Rushmore, because the way that we think of Mount Rushmore today, the way that Mount Rushmore comes to most of our minds and the way it's portrayed in popular culture has ended up being a lot different than what some of the original ideas for the monument were. So what can you tell us about the origins of the monument, the origins of the idea for the monument, how this really started coming about?
The idea for a mountain carving in the Black Hills came from the South Dakota state historian Doane Robinson, and he originally proposed this idea as a tourist attraction. He saw that the Black Hills were a beautiful place, and he wanted to give people a good reason to visit and to stay to explore more. And when he originally proposed this idea, he envisioned Western figures carved into the needles. Those are the tall granite spires located in the Central Hills. He had written about seeing people like Red Cloud or Lewis and Clark or Buffalo Bill Cody carved into the granite here.
So how did Mount Rushmore end up being the location? Obviously, there are a number of different options in the Black Hills. Why was Mount Rushmore the place that was chosen for the carving?
There are several different changes that happened after Doane Robinson recruited the sculptor Gutzon Borglum to the project. Borglum took a look at those tall, thin spires of granite known as the needles, and he saw that they were so weathered that they might not endure very long. They might not be carvable at all. Borglum immediately took the reins to scout other areas in the Black Hills. He saw the mountain known locally as Mount Rushmore and immediately saw that it checked all of the boxes, especially from an artistic perspective. It had a really nice fine-grained granite that made it ideal for sculpting. It also had a very broad face, so there was a lot of room to work with, but one of the things that was most important to him, it had good light. The mountain faces southeast, so it catches the first rays of the rising sun and it stays in light through most of the day. In addition, as this project started to evolve under Gutzon Borglum, the idea shifted from that original proposal of Western figures to the presidents that we see today.
And where does the name Rushmore come from? Who was Rushmore?
It's an unexpected part of the story here. The name Rushmore comes from Charles Rushmore, a New York City attorney. He was in this area during the mid-1880s. He had made friends with some of the locals in Keystone, and while they were coming past the mountainside, he asked them, "Hey, it's a really nice piece of rock there. I've always admired it. What do you call it?" And they had started to joke around with him a little bit, so they said, "We don't have a name, but we'll name it right now, and we will name it Mount Rushmore." After that, the name just stuck. However, that mountain has been known by many different names, both locally by Euro-American settlers and by the indigenous people here.
All right, and I want to return our attention to some of the figures that you mentioned already and some of the individuals who were considered for inclusion on Mount Rushmore. But before we do that, let's do a little more background on the area. So you obviously have talked already about how Mount Rushmore was chosen as the location, but what can you tell us about the Black Hills of South Dakota in general for people who might not be familiar with the area? And what can you tell us about the Sioux Nation and general background of this area prior to the sculpting of the monument?
The Black Hills of South Dakota are a really beautiful and geologically unique area. It's this area of granite It's an area of granite intrusion in the middle of the plains here. So we are called the island in the plains. We've got these beautiful granite mountains. We've got limestone, which gives us a lot of great caves in this area. And it's a beautiful ponderosa pine forest all around us. Today, it's known a lot for its outdoor recreation opportunities, but it has a really rich history as well. You had mentioned the indigenous people who do consider this area an important historical, spiritual, and cultural site. And there are many tribal nations who view the Black Hills that way. I had mentioned before that the mountain has been known by many names since time immemorial. One of the most well-known, in addition to Mount Rushmore, is Six Grandfathers.
So can you talk a little bit about the significance of this area to the indigenous people and who some of these indigenous peoples were that were living in this area prior to the sculpting of the monument?
There are many affiliated tribes to this area. I would recommend going to nps.gov/MORU for a full list of the affiliated tribes who are in consultation with the National Park Service today. They're actively included in these conversations. For more of information about exactly what the relevance of this site is to the indigenous people who have called this area home, that's a really complex subject. This is a place that has been home and includes all of those things that we associate with home. It's safety, it's comfort, it's food sources. It's also very spiritually and culturally significant. It has been since time immemorial. It continues to be to this day.
All right, so let's turn back to some of the people who were instrumental in the development, construction, sculpting of the monument that we see today. And you've already mentioned Doane Robinson a little bit. You've mentioned Gutzon Borglum a little bit. His son, Lincoln Borglum, was also heavily involved. What can you tell us about those three individuals in particular, their significance to this project and who they were and how they factored in?
Mount Rushmore is many things, and among those, it is the result of some really incredible collaboration and teamwork. It took a lot of key input from different people to make what we see today. Doane Robinson is very much considered the person who put this idea out into the world, the father of Mount Rushmore, sometimes called. Not only did he originally conceive this idea, he is the person who contacted Gutzon Borglum, who became the sculptor, and got him involved with the project. And following that, Robinson was really key to securing funding for the site. In addition, there are a few other figures that we get to talk about when we talk about really laying the groundwork for this project. Senator Peter Norbeck and Congressman William Williamson are fundamental to securing federal funding and getting the necessary support for the project, both locally and on a national political scale. In addition, local businessman John Boland did a lot to fundraise for the project, and he actively managed the finances on the site to make sure that all of this continued progressing forward. Gutzon Borglum is an essential piece of that. It's the sculptor of Mount Rushmore. Borglum designed and created the model that was used to direct the sculpting. He established the tools and processes necessary to carve on that scale, and he directed the workers in their day-to-day work. In addition, Gutzon's son, Lincoln Borglum, was his father's right-hand man in many ways. Lincoln Borglum worked several different positions on the mountain. It includes assisting in directing the work and doing some of the labor that directly carved the mountain. After Gutzon Borglum passed away, about 7 months before the end of the carving, Lincoln took on the responsibility of the sculptor. He wrapped up the ongoing work and he closed down the project. Lincoln also went on to become the first superintendent of Mount Rushmore.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the original idea behind Mount Rushmore did not necessarily focus on presidents, that there were proposals that would have involved heroes from the American West being included as part of the monument. Can you talk about exactly what the developers, what that proposal would have consisted of, what they had in mind for that version of Mount Rushmore, and how and why things shifted away from figures of the American West to American presidents?
Yeah, absolutely. Doane Robinson's first letter suggesting a carving in the Black Hills suggests a single figure, perhaps Chief Red Cloud. He writes. He envisioned that, again, on the Needles, which were overlooking a very beautiful scenic highway here known as Needles Highway. So he spoke very poetically of this single figure standing above the highway. But Within a month, looking at Doane Robinson's writing, he is quickly expanding on that idea. He starts to suggest other Western figures, Sacagawea, Buffalo Bill Cody, Lewis and Clark, others. Essentially, he envisioned all of the well-known names of the West at that time. As Gutzon Borglum gets involved with the project and hears more about what Doane Robinson is envisioning, he starts to suggest that if this is going to be a tourist attraction, it needs to have appeal nationwide. Borglum starts to bring in this idea of presidents. What's going to be more recognizable across this entire nation than those national leaders? And quickly, Borglum starts to steer into that direction. Eventually, Borglum himself is the one that selects the 4 figures that are carved on the mountain today, the 4 presidents that we see.
So how were those 4 presidents that were on the monument selected? Once they make the decision not to include figures from the American West, Lewis and Clark, Sacagawea, Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, some of the people that were under consideration there, and it shifts to presidents, why was it Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt? How were those the 4 who were selected for inclusion on the monument? And what does the inclusion of those 4 individuals represent as far as their placement on the monument?
Yeah, when Borglum chose the 4 presidents, he declared that each of them was going to represent part of the theme of the memorial. It was supposed to represent the first 150 years of American history. And each of those presidents was selected as an icon of a particular era of American history that they're representing. For George Washington, we have the foundation of the country as first president and a pivotal figure during the Revolutionary War. We have the foundation of our nation that's established, and then we have expansion. That's Thomas Jefferson. And that is an interesting one. When we think of Thomas Jefferson today, we usually think of accomplishments like helping to write the Declaration of Independence, but his specific placement on the mountain represents the Louisiana Purchase and that expansion of the nation. Next, we have, chronologically, we have Abraham Lincoln representing the preservation of the Union, and that's going to represent his involvement and his leadership during the Civil War. And finally, Theodore Roosevelt to represent the development of our country. Borglum really respected the way that Roosevelt was a trust buster, but especially saw his involvement on things like the Panama Canal as really helping to put America on the world stage. So in summary, the 4 presidents that were selected represent the 150 years of American history, representing foundation, expansion, preservation, and development.
Now, Mount Rushmore is often used as sort of a way to compare presidents and measure accomplishments and stature, historical stature of presidents. The monument was completed in 1941, so it might not actually be possible to go back up there and redo that or add. But would that at all be feasible? Because this is a topic that does come up periodically when going back, evaluating more recent presidents or evaluating presidents who maybe were previously overlooked. This notion of whether they're like Mount Rushmore status, whether they're a Mount Rushmore equivalent sort of person. Would that at all be a feasible thing to do, to add or make a significant adjustments to the monument?
There has been conversation around adding a 5th person to Mount Rushmore since the idea was proposed. Today, we look at that and we can clearly see there is no suitable rock for carving. In addition, when the carving did end in 1941, it was declared complete. So there will be no further work on Mount Rushmore.
Okay. All right. So you say that there's no suitable rock to add a president. Let's go back to the origins of the carving itself, where there was suitable rock available to carve presidents at the time, as of the beginning of this project in 1927. And can you talk a little bit about that process of actually creating, carving, sculpting, completing the sculpture? What did that look like? What were some of the main timetables attached to this? What were some of the milestones along the way? How did that process unfold?
Yeah. So first, as an overview of what that process took, the sculpture took about 14 years to carve. Work began in October of 1927, ended October 31st, 1941. One thing that's interesting, considering delays due to weather and inconsistent funding at times, if we add up the actual time spent laboring on Mount Rushmore, that only adds up to about 6.5 years, which is a surprisingly short time for as monumental as that scale is. And the process of carving the mountain was very well coordinated and very carefully measured every step of the way, especially considering one of the main tools was dynamite. There's not a lot of room for mistake when you're working with that kind of medium. Everything on the mountain today was measured off of a studio scale model, which is something we still have on site today. So the day's work would start with either the sculptor or one of his assistants, known as a pointer, taking a series of measurements across that scale model. They would then head up onto the mountainside with a bucket of red paint, and all across the side of the mountain, they would paint out the day's instructions. It might look like remove 6 feet of rock here, remove 12 feet of rock there. When the men were ready to start actually carving into the mountain, they would get in small chairs known as bosun chairs and be lowered over the side of the mountain attached to a winch. They would be holding an air-powered jackhammer that would weigh between 35 and 50 pounds. When they got in place on the mountainside, the day's instructions were already waiting for them. They would spend their day drilling into that solid granite, again with an air-powered jackhammer. And twice a day, everybody would move off the mountain for the daily dynamite blasts. Dynamite would be inserted into those freshly drilled holes. And through this process of drilling and dynamiting, they start to round out the shapes of the faces. One thing that's very fortunate for Borglum working in this area, the majority of the men who are taking on those roles as drillers and carvers, they were former hard rock miners. That meant they already knew a thing or two about dynamite. They had the skill to cut down dynamite charges to precise amounts. That way they could remove exact amounts of rock. They claim that they were so skilled they could get within 2 or 3 inches of the final surface we see today using that dynamite. And when you look at Mount Rushmore today, you can get an idea of the size of rock that was being removed. Underneath the faces that are sculpted is a series of rock fall called talus, and that adds up to about 450,000 tons of granite removed, primarily doing that drilling and dynamiting process. But once you're 2 or 3 inches away from the final surface, it's time to put down the dynamite. It's time to slow down. It's time to be a lot more precise and a lot more careful. At that point, they moved into a process called honeycombing. It's a series of closely spaced holes drilled to exact depth. And honeycombed granite can be removed using just a hammer and chisel. And as that honeycombed granite is chipped away, we start to see the gradients. We start to see curves. And on that scale, those small gradients and curves soon start to add up to the curve of a cheek or the slope of a nose. That honeycombing process gives them the ability to make recognizable features of the presidents. After the honeycombing is complete, the faces themselves are recognizable, but there's a very rough and uneven texture left behind. And this is one of the most time-consuming parts of the process. The workers were given another air-powered tool called a bumping tool with a small bit about 1 inch across that would bump into the granite. And that bumping would slowly wear away all of those rough spots. Now, for a little bit of perspective on exactly how much patience that process took, those faces are about 60 feet tall. Imagine being handed a 1-inch bit and told you are going to smooth down every inch of a 60-foot tall face. But that patience paid off. Today, the faces are about as smooth as a concrete sidewalk.
So how many people would be working on the project at any given time? And do we have any estimates on total numbers of individuals who worked on the project from its beginning in 1927 until it was declared finished or complete in 1941?
From the start of the project to the end, we have records of about 400 workers at Mount Rushmore, and certainly those were not all at one time. The exact number that are on site at any time is a little bit tougher to give you numbers because they would vary so much depending on funding and depending on the kinds of roles that were needed. The number of actual drillers that could be on the mountainside is very limited because you can only have so many people. You cannot stack them with that kind of work. But there's a lot of support staff as well. It's going to be everybody from the blacksmith on site to the person running the air compressors to the person at the winch on top of the mountain to the women who are helping to do the clerical work and running the gift shops and visitor services that had started that early. So 400 workers total, but at any given time, we're looking at maybe around 75.
If you're an aspiring podcaster, then joining Podcasters Paradise is an absolute must. Podcasters Paradise is a premium membership community that will help you create, grow, and monetize your podcast. With step-by-step video tutorials, resources, and templates, and daily support via the private Facebook group, Podcasters Paradise is the best place to learn how to be a successful podcaster. Joining Podcasters Paradise has helped me with my podcast in so many ways. It is truly a tremendous resource. Plus, as an added bonus, if you join Podcasters Paradise through my link, then after you launch your podcast, I will mention on my show and link to your podcast from placesandprofiles.com, as long as your podcast is not inappropriate and is not significantly opposed to my beliefs and values. Check out Podcasters Paradise and get started on your podcasting journey today by going to placesandprofiles.com/paradise. Again, that's placesandprofiles.com/paradise. Now, you mentioned the career background and the technical background of some of these individuals a little bit, but what else can you tell us about their background? Were these locals from South Dakota who were recruited? Were these people who came in from elsewhere? Just who were these people that were working on the sculpting and construction of the monument? And what was it like once they actually got there and they were working? What were their accommodations like? What was the kind of day-to-day process like for these individuals who spent this time sculpting and constructing the monument during that 14-year window?
The backgrounds and the experience of the workers varies a lot from position to position and from the time period. When the project started, the majority of the people working there were locals from Keystone, unemployed hard rock miners, as I mentioned before. So when you think of accommodations, they're walking up the mountain from home every day. But as we get further into the project and it is a little better known, we do start to see people coming from further away if they have specific skill sets. So we have the majority of the labor being done by people who have the skill with jackhammers and dynamite, but the overall work that's being directed does still need that artistic guidance. So we do sometimes see artists coming to this area who are working under Borglum to help direct the work. In addition, as we get further into this project, we enter the Great Depression, and that's where we're more likely to see people coming from further away because this is a decent paying job for the time period. It would be paying about $8 a day to be a driller. By contrast, the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, would be paying $1 a day. So being able to get hired on as a Mount Rushmore carver was a good experience. And in addition, as more people are coming from further away to take advantage of the opportunities here, the women in Keystone start to see opportunities to support the workers and support themselves by extension. That's when they'll start to open up things like boarding houses, they'll open up dormitories and other support services.
Now, when we talk about some of the services and some of the accommodations that were available to the workers, of course, we have to mention that unfortunately, some of these workers who signed up to work on this project did not make it, that they met their ultimate demise while working on this project. What can you tell us about some of the tragedies and deaths that befell some of the workers who were working on Mount Rushmore?
I am very happy to tell you that there was no loss of life during the carving of Mount Rushmore. Nobody died during that process.
Okay, magnificent. All right. Well, then I retract what I said in the statement. I don't know where I got that from. Then that's fantastic. Now you've mentioned the subject of funding a few times over the course of this conversation. So, what were some of the sources of funding? How much money was spent for funding this project? What can you tell us about what that looked like?
Mm-hmm. This project originally started on the state level and with a lot of local involvement. So when it began, it was a lot of local fundraising efforts. But in the end, the project was about 85% federally funded. If we add up the cost to carve Mount Rushmore, it comes out to just under $1 million in its time, $989,992 to be exact, but who's counting? But when we look at that, we do see, like I said, a significant amount of that funding coming from the federal government. And then the local fundraising efforts that came from both businessmen who were interested in promoting the tourism in this area, and sometimes efforts as small as school children donating their nickels and pennies.
And how did available funds change the trajectory of the project over time? I think I saw somewhere that the reason that Washington is the only figure on the monument who has anything sculpted below the face below the chin was due to funding concerns that came about along the way. So how did the scope of the project change as funding expectations changed as well?
Mhm. There are many different reasons the original model does not look the same as what we see on the mountainside today. Some of those do come down to funding, especially when the project ended in 1941. All of the funding that had already been appropriated was running out, and it became very clear in late fall of 1941 there was going to be no further funding. It was very obvious that we were heading into this war effort. But in addition, there are other factors for why we see two different things between the model and the mountainside. And a lot of it does come back to that suitable rock as well. If you were to look up at the mountainside and take a look at George Washington, you would see the white granite across his face and the top part where the collar and those first details are. And then as you go further down, you would see a stripe of really dark gray rock, and that's called mica schist. It's a mineral intrusion in the middle of that granite. And granite is made up of very fine crystals. It shapes very well. It holds together. Mica schist is made up of layers that are very fragile. If you get too close to that, that mica schist will start to just shatter. And as soon as they found that intrusion of schist and determined that it likely ran all the way across the mountain, they realized they would never be able to do that half bust that they had intended. In addition, there are questions about other places where the rock might be suitable. For example, one of the most obvious places where the model and the mountain do not match is Abraham Lincoln never got an ear on that side. And there's questions over how possible it is to even carve an ear out of a granite mountainside.
All right, now let's return to talking about the location and that general area. So earlier we gave some background on the Black Hills. We talked about a little bit about the significance of the Black Hills to numerous indigenous groups in the area. Something that has come into existence, or at least has a project that has begun, a very long-term project fairly close to Mount Rushmore that has also become a tourist attraction, is the Crazy Horse Memorial. So for someone who's interested in this part of South Dakota and this part of the country, what can you tell us about the Crazy Horse Memorial and how that fits in and compares to nearby Mount Rushmore?
Yeah. Crazy Horse is located about half an hour away from Mount Rushmore, and it's very common for people to see both during their visit. They are two very different sites. And Crazy Horse, as you mentioned, is still in progress. It is larger in size. The face is complete, and that face measures 87 feet tall compared to the faces on Mount Rushmore, which are 60 feet tall. In addition, the intention with Crazy Horse Memorial is a much larger carving overall, featuring both Lakota warrior Crazy Horse and the actual horse that often he is envisioned with due to that memorial. And that entire sculpture would be 640 feet long and 563 feet high. So as a whole, it would be on a much larger scale than Mount Rushmore National Memorial. It is a privately owned site, so we do have some differences that come through that, and partially because of that, I can't speak as much to what the overall vision and goal is.
Absolutely. But it is interesting that one of the figures who may have been a part of a Mount Rushmore that would have been more based around heroes and figures of the American West as opposed to presidents, one of the figures from that sort of original proposal, original vision, does end up having a memorial in the Black Hills of South Dakota years later. So it's interesting at least how that piece worked out.
Yeah, absolutely. Mount Rushmore National Memorial is such a interesting site. It's centered in this incredibly culturally and historically rich area. It's an icon that draws a lot of attention, but it's certainly not the only thing that this area has to offer. Right.
So a few more questions quickly here before we wrap up. And you mentioned what that area has to offer. And of course, by that area, we've been talking about the Black Hills and that part of South Dakota, but Mount Rushmore, of course, has become an icon for the entire state of South Dakota, perhaps the most iconic location in South Dakota. South Dakota is often referred to by the nickname of the Mount Rushmore state. So can you speak a little bit to the impact that the monument has had in general on the reputation, the image, the economy of South Dakota, the tourist industry in South Dakota? Just how influential and significant has the development and existence of the monument been to the state of South Dakota as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. Mount Rushmore is a prominent part of South Dakota's state image. As you mentioned, the Mount Rushmore state is the state nickname, and it is on our state flag as well. In addition, Mount Rushmore has very much lived up to that original goal that Doane Robinson set. The recent visitor spending effects report showed Mount Rushmore brings nearly $400 billion to this area. It continues to be a really key part of not only the cultural landscape, but the economic landscape of South Dakota.
And how many people visit Mount Rushmore on an annual basis? What sorts of statistics and numbers can you provide as far as the actual visitors and the impact that tourism has in that sense on South Dakota?
Mount Rushmore National Memorial averages between 2 and 2.5 million visitors each year.
All right. Now, obviously, Mount Rushmore's significance extends beyond just the Black Hills and beyond just the state of South Dakota. It has come up in numerous other areas, and it really has become an American icon. And one place that we have seen Mount Rushmore featured prominently is in popular culture. The famed Alfred Hitchcock movie North by Northwest. There was the Nicolas Cage movie National Treasure Book of Secrets. There have been so many different places where we have seen Mount Rushmore play a role in film, in TV, in broader pop culture. What can you say about the significance of Mount Rushmore as a phenomenon in pop culture, in addition to just kind of in the American zeitgeist, in the American cultural context?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. Mount Rushmore has very much taken on this life as one of the most recognized symbols in the world. It's an icon in media, advertisements, politics, more. And along with being prominently featured in TV shows and movies, it's also often used as shorthand for describing the most notable figures in a field. It's really common to hear, who's your Mount Rushmore of this sport, or who's your Mount Rushmore in influential music. It's really taken on this status as a recognizable icon, both to represent a lot of American culture, but also to represent this overall heritage that we have.
Yeah, and it's really amazing that has happened, but it's so true that any number of disciplines, any number of fields, Mount Rushmore is a shorthand for figuring out who the most significant, influential, greatest individuals are in those areas. It's really a spectacular phenomenon, just all the places that we see that imagery and symbolism of Mount Rushmore popping up.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, in the historical and political world, Mount Rushmore, carries extra significance. And I mentioned earlier that it has a role in the political discourse, in the evaluation of American presidents. Now, I know you said that it's not really feasible to add additional presidents or additional figures to Mount Rushmore, as fascinating as of a topic as that may be, to discuss theoretically, that in actuality, that's not really feasible. But do you have any information on kind of when this started to become a thing that Mount Rushmore would be used as a measuring stick, as a metric by which to measure leaders and presidents? Did this come about during the earliest days of the monument, or is this something that kind of developed over time? Was there like a pivotal moment where this really started happening? What information can you provide there?
Yeah, there's a lot that goes into Mount Rushmore becoming the icon that it is today. And it is something that does start to develop even at the very beginning. I had mentioned several times that Doane Robinson had that goal of it being a tourist site, and he was really successful with both the timing and the location and how it was able to very immediately draw this crowd of people who were taking on this new idea of the great American road trip. In addition, the location made it so that people were more likely to stop while they were traveling from the east to these really big name brand parks like Yellowstone. So very early on, it was able to start to catch that attention of people who would see it even while it was being created. And I think that it was able to get some of that initial momentum because people who were visiting very much had that sense of I am witnessing history being made. And that allowed people to really feel involved and help to spread the word of what this site was. In addition, it's been able to be very present on people's minds during some key cultural moments. So thinking things like celebrating key anniversaries in our nation's history. It's able to be very present for that. And with that, Mount Rushmore was able to really take on this role as being an American heritage site and an American icon, a place where people could travel from across the nation and really gather together and feel connected to each other and to the site. In addition, the media that it's been able to attract over the years has gone on to amplify that image. So it's not only an American icon, it's something that's now seen across the world and immediately recognizable as this deeply recognizable symbolic representation of American heritage. So memorial in every sense of the word.
All right. Well, Sarah Beth, I want to thank you so much for joining me. Obviously, Mount Rushmore is a topic that has multiple layers to it, a lot of different facets, a lot of different angles, a lot of different aspects. Is there anything that we haven't touched on today that you think would be crucial or interesting or essential to understanding the story and the significance of Mount Rushmore?
Visiting Mount Rushmore really does help with understanding and enriching the experience, having that meaningful experience and that recreation the National Park Service really strives for. It's a place where we have this wonderful opportunity to invite people to collaborate in sharing this culture, sharing this stewardship, and being an inspiration for social and environmental consciousness. While we're here, we get this chance to discuss these accurate and meaningful stories of our sites and our nation. We give visitors the opportunity to come to their own conclusions and find their own personal connections to this site. And we, like these four presidents, are human with all the complexities that come with that. And while we're here, we're invited to explore those complexities. While we're here, rather than simplify anything into binaries and dichotomies that sow division, we have this chance to really come together, to experience this with the people who have also taken the time to travel to the site and to feel really deeply connected to what we have.
All right. And having been to Mount Rushmore twice myself, it's definitely an interesting and in many ways rewarding experience, awe-inspiring experience to be at Mount Rushmore. So for anyone who has an opportunity to travel to the Black Hills of South Dakota, that's an awe-inspiring area in and of itself, but especially to go to Mount Rushmore, that's definitely something that I personally recommend based on my own experiences there. If someone is interested in getting more information about visiting the monument, about these sorts of topics that we've been discussing today with the history and the significance and the key figures and the process and some of what makes Mount Rushmore so influential. If someone wants to learn more about any of those things, what are some readings or some resources or some websites that you would encourage them to take a look at so that they can add to the story and the picture and their own experiences with the monument?
Yeah, I highly recommend visiting our website. That's, again, nps.gov/MORU. We do have articles that explore some of the different aspects from the influential people to the place setting itself. In addition, the NPS website as a whole explores more of the greater concepts around it. It has articles that go beyond each individual site to capture more of the cultural shared moments. In addition, going to things like our YouTube channel, there are videos that explore these concepts more, and the social media will keep you more in touch with the day-to-day happenings. But finally, being on site, if possible, we have a really incredible, skilled series of rangers that come here and present these wonderful ranger walks, everything from the evening program at night to short studio talks in the sculptor studio in front of the actual model. And all of that comes together to really create an appreciation of both the tangible site that we have here and the greater context that it exists in.
All right. Well, Sarah Beth, I want to thank you so much for joining me today and being generous with your time. And I want to remind everyone the show notes page for today's episode is placesandprofiles.com/24. So all of those great resources pertaining to the monument, social media accounts, the website for the monument, for the memorial itself, all of that will be linked on the show notes page. So placesandprofiles.com/24. And Sarah Beth, thank you so much again for joining me. I feel like we covered a lot of ground, and I appreciate how concise and on point your answers were. That was fantastic, and I think that this was an excellent way to introduce people to the history and significance of the monument, and ideally, some people will now be inspired to try to fit Mount Rushmore into their travel plans. But regardless, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time here today.
Thank you so much. We had a great conversation.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Places and Profiles podcast. Please visit placesandprofiles.com to subscribe and listen to more episodes. Come back again soon, and thanks for listening.